the most influential American painters of the 20th century, Jasper Johns invented a new style based on the artistic use of classical iconography. His subtle didacticism expressed through an interest in the ready-made image marked a return to subject matter in painting, thus allowing a reimagination of familiar imagery and symbols. Isabelle Loring Wallace is Associate Professor of Art History in the University of Georgia Lamar Dodd School of Art. She discusses her monograph, Jasper Johns, recently published by Phaidon.
White flag in 1955 has lost the aura of scandal that clung to it when it was first.
Yeah.
What is that about? What was the scandal?
Well, you know, in the 50s and early 60s, the American flag, and still of course today, but to a lesser degree, was a very sacred kind of image. And just the simple fact of painting it, whether one painted it in all white or whether one painted it as he first did in the appropriate various colors, was a dubious act. So even if there wasn't anything overtly sacrilegious about it, people wondered what exactly you were up to in doing that. And in fact, Alfred Barr, who selected 4 works for purchase from John's first show in 1958, which is a kind of an astonishing, unheard of thing, selected flag, the original flag, the colored flag, for purchase, and then became so nervous about what the board might think of it that he convinced his friend Philip Johnson, the architect and fellow curator at MoMA, to kind of buy it and hold it in reserve until a more appropriate moment might come for its inclusion in the collection. So if the flag painted in the appropriate colors was nervous-making for Alfred Barr, you could imagine that a white flag with these kind of ghostly connotations, which maybe suggest some loss of standing for the United States on an international field, would be all the more troublesome. But now I think, you know, first of all, our relationship to images is very different. You can think of Photoshop, to take a very practical example. We all are skilled to varying degrees in manipulating images, and we think of that as our right, no matter how much significance those images might have elsewhere. And I think we just don't have the kind of reverence for symbols in that way that we might have once had.
Did it have resonance because it was a reminder of that, or was it a re-entry into representation in a way from artists that mattered and were taken as serious and legitimate?
Yeah, I think representation was a dangerous game in the middle years of the 20th century, and people are used to saying by now that it was Johns and Rauschenberg who cleared the way for the return of reference for art that might be in some overt, straightforward way about things in the world or places in the world. Rather than more heady, abstract ideas, as were promoted by the abstract expressionists. So I think that is a significant part of John's legacy, that he brings reference back into the work of art, sometimes with scandalous effect and sometimes without.
He was sort of the prototypical New York story art. He became that in the way that he was kind of just plucked out of obscurity. And that became the operative myth for a lot of artists moving to New York.
Yeah, the pace at which artists become famous changed dramatically in the middle years of the 20th century, probably with Pollock first, who goes from being a kind of laughingstock to a hero to a laughingstock in a matter of 10 years. And Johns is part of that moment too. And as I said, this thing about Alfred Barr choosing so many works from what was his first one-man exhibition at the Leo Castelli Gallery is an extraordinary, extraordinary thing. And I think it set an expectation for younger artists that is maybe unreasonable.
And they put Target on the cover of Art News.
Yeah, in 1958. That's right.
Is there some parallel between Johns as a precursor to pop and Cezanne as a precursor to Cubism? Like neither one would have had anything to do with those, maybe, but they cleared the way.
I think so, and one of them you've mentioned, that they lay the groundwork for something that will come after them and be codified as a movement. One of the things that's interesting to me about Johns is that his work escapes any such codification. So we think of him as playing this important role of laying the groundwork for pop art, laying the groundwork for postmodernism, but as his career goes on over the course of 60-some years, he's outside every single conventional movement that one might name that operates in the course of those 60 years. So he has a strange relationship to the isms or the movements or the trends of the 20th century. On the one hand, enormously influential, on the other hand, entirely removed from what might be the kind of narrative that we tell about 20th century art. And I think in some ways the same thing could be said about Cezanne. Oh, very interesting. The Catenary paintings are probably the most recent coherent body of work that Johns has done, although he's subsequently on to other things. But they are largely monochromatic gray paintings. Johns has made a number of monochromatic gray paintings over the course of his career, but these are the most recent ones. And they're called Catenaries because each one of them includes a string that is suspended from either side of the canvas, the left and right hand edges of the canvas. And they form this sag, therefore, in front of the canvas, which produces a modest shadow on the surface of the gray field. A catenary is a technical term that Johns didn't know until after he'd made the first such catenary painting, but he was introduced to the term in the context of people responding to these paintings. And it is simply that. It's an arc that comes from the suspension of a curved line. And I guess the most practical application of it would be in a suspension bridge. And indeed, one of the paintings in the Catenary series is called Bridge. The crosshatch paintings are probably the most difficult works for people to access by Johns. They're among my most favorite works, but they are indeed a return to abstraction. So Johns, having been credited with moving art away from abstraction in the middle years of the 1950s, paradoxically, maybe even perversely returns to abstraction in the 1970s. And he entitles the first painting in the crosshatch series, which is comprised simply of bunches of parallel lines, Scent, which is the title of the last work that Jackson Pollock will execute before his untimely demise. So there's a way in which Johns makes perfectly clear through the title of that painting that he's not just experimenting with abstraction, but picking up in some sense where abstraction left off. And I think what those paintings do is try to reconcile an expressive notion of abstraction where it's all about emotion and personal kinds of sentiments and confessions with this other kind of abstraction which we have, which is geometric and which purports to be about various kinds of ideals that are in their own way abstract. And I think he tries to bring the two of them together. The charge was to write a book that is accessible. And first of all, Johns is a difficult artist and it's hard to talk about him in ways that are accessible. And so in some ways that made my job harder rather than easier, as I'm sure you can imagine. I also found it rewarding, I guess, to try and bring these very difficult works and the rigorousness of John's own enterprise to a broad audience that I think appreciates John's work for its beauty, but maybe remains somewhat confused as to the larger implications of the work and the kind of philosophical dimension of the work. So the challenge of the book for me, as I saw it, was to get a broader audience to understand that his work marries these two things that are seen as incompatible in the history of art. We talk about artists who are artist on the one hand, and we say that their work is all about form and beauty and material concerns. And then we talk about conceptual art on the other hand, and we imagine that it's all about ideas and that those ideas come at the expense of the work as a material object. And for me, Johns is the artist who more successfully than any other in the 20th century, brings those two things together and uses form philosophically. And so for me, the purpose of the book in some sense was to simply explain that as best I could.